thanks everyone for joining us, and especially thanks very much to Miriam for giving some of your time to speak to us this evening. We really appreciate it, and it's really fantastic to meet you. Just a couple of housekeeping things. So if this is your first time joining one of our events, we are FEDSA, the Front-End Developers South Africa, a non-profit. And you've already met Skulk, who can wave if he likes. Skulk and I were initially part of what was called Cape Town Front-End Developers, which was started in 2012, running meetups and workshops and so on. And then the non-profit we decided to form, what, 2 years ago, more or less. And you know, the state moves slowly in these things, but we finally were registered towards the beginning of this year. So just a couple of things that are going on. First of all, we started a podcast and we recorded the first episode 2 weeks ago, and that is up on our SoundCloud. And I've added that to the chat, the link there. And that is Amo and Leandri, who, if you've joined before, know they are our fellow organizers. And they were talking about their journeys as self-taught front-end developers. And there's some really great stuff in that. I urge you to give it a listen. And if you are unaware, we are planning a conference, a front-end conference for October. And we put up the website. It's kind of bare bones at the moment, but we have a call for papers there. So if you'd like to speak at that, it will all be online, given the situation we still find ourselves in. And if you could also, you know, spread the word about that, that would be great. We've put up a little bit of ideas there on the About page, where you can see the kinds of topics that we're interested in, but really anything to do with front end, but also UI and user interface and user experience design. Okay, and our website is fedsa.org, which you can also have a look at. Right, that's my spiel out of the way. And so we're very happy to have Miriam here with us this evening. Miriam has, well, I first became aware of your work with Susie, and your work with SAS. And Susie was a game changer back in the day when we were dealing with float-based layouts, and I think it changed a lot of our working. I know Skulk also used it and was a fan of it. It really helped us so much back then when we were working with the terrible state of layout in the browser. So thank you very much for that. But you're also very much involved with the CSS Working Group, and I think me personally, I have a lot of things I may want to ask you about that process, because I think it's quite opaque to those of us who aren't involved with it, and don't really have the time to follow the GitHub issue trackers and so on. And then I see, of course, and I'm sure you were aware that this would appear, Skulk has just typed container queries in the chat. Yeah. So yeah, again, thanks so much for being here, and I'll hand over to you to take us through. I know you've prepared some slides for us. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It's lovely to be here. Thank you all for having me. Nice to be back in South Africa from a distance. Yeah, I do have some slides. I'll try to move through them quickly because I want to make sure that we have time for questions and answers. I think maybe for that, I'll just go straight through. I'm talking about 3 features ending with container queries. I know that's the big one. And then hopefully we'll have plenty of time for Q&A after that. So I'll share my screen here. Oh, I need permission to share my screen.
Skulk is in charge.
Cool, you should have permission now.
Got it. Thank you. All right, that's showing up for all of you?
Yes, we can see it, thanks.
Great. So yeah, we're talking about the future of CSS, but in order to understand where we're going, we have to understand where we are and how we got here. And for me, the big framing for all of this is that CSS exists for two reasons. The first is to make our styles more responsive, and not just to viewports, but also to user preferences and device capabilities. When Sir Tim and the team at CERN released the first hypermedia browser, it was designed for the next machine, and you can see it's a graphic user interface. This was 8990. But you can't make a web that's worldwide by saying it works on my machine and everybody else is an edge case. You have to support all of the browsers and computers that are out there and able to connect to the internet. So they right away released a second browser that is the line mode browser, which you interact with using just a keyboard, typing in numbers, no graphic interface, no mouse or anything. And this actually becomes the mission statement of the web, web for all, web on everything. And that includes assistive devices. And even right from the beginning, they're thinking about speech and what will the web look like where there's no graphic interface at all. And in that first website, it actually says there will never be design on the web. It says we can't do anything that will control fonts or colors because fonts and colors don't exist everywhere and are different everywhere, so we can't do it. But when CSS comes along, what makes it work is this quote from Hao Kwon Lee's initial proposal. We want to provide hints that the browser may or may not use. So we don't control fonts and colors on the web, we hint and we suggest. And the cascade is what makes all of that possible. That term comes from the idea of an order list or cascade of style sheets that can be referenced from a document, not only the styles that we link to the document, but also users and browsers can specify their initial styling preferences and hand the remaining influence over to us. So we get this, the cascade starts with cascade origins, those three places that style sheets might come from, the author or document itself, the user, and the user agent or the browser. And the cascade exists. What we call the cascade now is the set of rules for resolving any conflicts between those style sheets. So initially, we take precedence over everybody. Users come next, and the browser is sort of the base. The browser provides a readable universal style sheet. Users add their preferences on top of that, and we get to override everybody. But Hao Kwon was very clear that if conflicts arise, the user should have the last word, not us, not the author. And that's why importance exists. Important gives the user and the browser ability to say some things are too important to hand over control. And so we create these three extra layers on top in reverse order. And you can see our two layers are right there in the middle. So importance for us can feel like just another layer of specificity. But the reason it exists is actually for the user and the user agent to take back control of a style sheet. The second thing that CSS is for and is making our style sheets reusable. Instead of repeating the same styles over and over in every single paragraph, we can select a paragraph and style them all at once. And this allows us to create patterns using things like classes and attributes, and then combine those to compose larger objects and create entire design systems and component libraries. CSS is sort of object-oriented from the start. You can even see it in the language, inheritance, classes, things like that. But it's also cascading, and that's fundamentally different from what we're used to or otherwise referred to as object-oriented programming. CSS is cascade-oriented. And the cascade is really there to resolve the conflicts. Because we have these selectors, we can style the same element in multiple different ways, in multiple different blocks, and we can create conflicts from that. We can't apply all these backgrounds, we have to choose one. So we start doing that after we've dealt with origin and which origin takes precedence. We can look at specificity. And specificity is a heuristic, which means it's a guess. It's a good guess at what we want. And the guess is The more we're targeting something, the more important it is to us. The more general the style, the less important it is to us. And so we can build up these layers from general styles that are less important to more specific styles that are more important. So that's a clever heuristic. Gives us universal and type selectors that are meant to be global defaults that have very low specificity. And we work our way up. Attributes and classes are a little bit more specific, both in terms of targeting and in terms of their specificity weight. And then IDs are singular, very targeted, and have the highest specificity. So we stack these up in a similar way to stacking up the origins. But there's a little bit of a problem. It can get complicated, especially when we talk about things at scale, which can mean a lot of different things. But as teams get bigger, as projects get more complicated, we find that sometimes there are very specific defaults. We need to be very targeted about something that we actually just want it there as a base style and we want to override it easily. And vice versa, we have utilities that are very important, but also very general. So the heuristic doesn't always work. That's sort of what you get from a guess. And within these stacked specificity layers, there's only one of them where we have total control, and that's classes and attributes. We get to define them. We get to apply them anywhere. They're totally ours to use how we want. So we end up often fighting over just minimal space within that one layer of specificity with rules and conventions that try to ensure our specificity is matching the heuristics. Our selectors are matching that broad reach, low specificity. And then as we get more explicit and narrower reach, we have higher specificity. This is from Harry Roberts' inverted triangle. And we try to match that carefully to layers of intent, building up from global abstractions to components and what he called trumps. I called that an override. Or, you know, we're throwing importance when we get stuck, or when somebody doesn't quite play along with the system and we have to override a third-party tool. And this is where the first feature comes in. It's called Cascade Layers. And this was approved by the CSS Working Group last February, and it's something that browsers are going to start implementing probably this year. This spec has been moving very fast, but the idea is to take these layers of intent and allow authors to make them explicit. And in some ways, it's like origins because we're dealing with potentially different sources of the information, even maybe different teams on a project. So the global design system, that might be a separate team from who's actually building the app. And these are in some ways different origins of detail about a site. And we want to stack these in layers, whatever we want to call them, building up from resets, frameworks, themes, components. And then also using importance in the same way that we did with origins, where a reset can say, actually, there are some very important resets that should override everything. There are some important things in a theme that we don't want to override easily, even though we do want to override themes generally from components. So we have two syntaxes for this. One is adding a function to the import rule so that you could import an entire style sheet into a layer. So this is import the headings.css into the default layer. And the other is an @ rule where we can create a block of code, say we want this in the default layer, and any code inside of that rule will be considered part of that layer. And we can combine these and actually merge them. So we can have two things that we're adding into the default layer, and those will get grouped together. Layers stack in the order they were first defined, with the highest layer taking precedence. So in this case, the default layer starts, and then theme layer builds on top of that, and the components layer builds on top of that. And then specificity only matters inside each layer. Specificity doesn't cross over layers. In this case, the override layer wins because it comes second, even though it has a lower specificity. The rule that we're talking about in there. Oh, it is refusing to go back to that slide. There we go. But we don't need to actually have all of our styles in that order. It doesn't have to be that carefully maintained. We can establish those layers. It's the order in which they first appear. So here we're repeating the default layer twice, but because it was introduced first, it is still the first layer. So we can keep adding things back into lower layers from later in the document. Which then we have some syntax for making that even simpler to declare upfront all of my layers in the order I want them. You can do that by just declaring the layer, but we also allow then a comma separated syntax to say, here, set up all of my layers in order. And then I want to be able to write the code in any order I want, but they should always come back to this layer order. This also means that when we're importing third-party tools, we can establish before we import exactly where those third-party tools should be brought into our layering system. So yeah, one of the goals is to make sure that we have final control. No matter what Bootstrap goes off and does, we can import their library into whatever sort of layering system we have and not fight them for importance. This also gives framework and component library authors a way to provide layers that we can hook into from their end, explicitly share with us a specific layering of the Bootstrap library or something. And they can do that either through explicit layers or through importing all of them. And we can actually nest these layers, which is important if we're going to be doing imports. If Bootstrap has created some layers and we're importing Bootstrap into a layer, we have this concept of nested layers and actually a syntax to access them more directly. And then finally, we have to deal with unlayered styles because there are a lot of those out there already and will be more. But right now, the idea is that unlayered styles win. They're given the highest layer. So by default, we're adding lower weight layers when we add a layer. And this gives us a little bit more control over the cascade, a little bit more explicit ability to manage it for ourselves with fewer hacks, fewer messing with specificity to try to represent these layers, and hopefully throwing around importance a little less or using it for what it's actually intended for, which is that putting something in a low layer and then saying, this is important enough that it should override the higher layers. Going into the next feature, which is scope. And this one is actually the furthest behind in terms of specification and implementation. But it's pretty familiar to a lot of people who have used CSS and JS particularly, but it also overlaps with BEM syntax, which is fairly popular. And the first goal here is to avoid naming conflicts between components and especially across larger teams again. And we do that by expressing membership, lower boundaries or proximity. That is to say, we can put a title class inside of a post class and we get this sense of nesting, but it doesn't really convey that it is the title of the post. And that is often what BEM syntax is used for, is to say, this isn't just any title in the post, this is the post title. And so we combine those into one to make it a little bit more explicit and describe that it belongs to the post. It's not just inside of. The other way that we do this with build tools is like what Vue does here, adding a data attribute to everything that belongs to the post and saying, so this is a generated data attribute that says data jkghj. Those are all the things in the post scope. So this is a title belonging to that scope. And if we want some global title styles, we end up using multiple classes and hoping the more targeted pattern will override the global pattern. Another way to think about this is what Nicole Sullivan calls donut scope, which is to say that sometimes a component has a hole in the middle of it, and the scope needs to be the tabs themselves, but not everything that we put inside of the tab content, or the media object itself as a scope, but not everything inside of the media content. And this is a little bit different from DOM encapsulation, Shadow DOM, which we already have. Shadow DOM draws hard boundaries in the DOM on elements specifically, and then nothing gets in or out. There's hard boundaries drawn in. But I was pushing away from that in my proposal here to say, instead, we want something a little bit more CSS-like, a little bit more like the build tools that we have for scope, where scopes can overlap, they can be more fluid, and we can decide which styles flow through globally and which styles should respect which boundaries. That, again, gives us more control from the CSS over how those boundaries work. So for that one, we're proposing an at-scope rule that accepts both a root and lower boundaries, any number of lower boundaries in that second parentheses there. So in this case, we're styling everything from the media class itself down inside of its tree until we get to .content, and then we're not styling anything inside of .content. So we can safely say in the scope of media to content, we want to style the media image, and we know that it belongs to the media object. I think another way to think about this is with theming. If we have like a light theme and a dark theme, right now we run into this problem where if you start nesting them, you can see the dark theme style color is always taking precedence for the link, just because the dark theme was described second in the source order. And that's not what we want. What we really want is some sense of proximity where the nearest theme takes precedence over the farther away theme. So we are trying to add, well, you can do this somewhat just with lower boundaries. You could say, just style the theme until you run into another theme. I'm doing that with data attributes here. So a scope of data theme light until we hit any other data theme. And we can manage that just with lower boundaries. That's how most of the build tools do it. But we could also add this concept of proximity so that when two themes have the same specificity and they interact like this, the closer one takes precedence. And there's more resources on that. I've shared the slides link. You can take a look. Now we're going to get into container queries quick. 1 second. I know this is throwing a lot of new ideas out there all at once. That's sort of my job now. So the real reason we're here, container queries. People have been asking for this feature ever since media queries came out. That's like 10 to 12 years people have been talking about container queries and always told that it's impossible. What we can do right now is we can look at the size of the overall viewport, and as the viewport gets bigger or smaller, we can make changes to a component based on that viewport size. But that doesn't actually reflect what we're doing on the web. We put components like this card in different contexts. And what we really want to do is say, when it's in a small context, it should be the small version. And when it's in a large context, it should be the larger version. We want something like this. And we want that to work no matter where those containers are, what those containers are, or how they're defined. We want to be able to set up different containers that we can respond to. So there were two proposals that came out last year. One from David Barron for the @container syntax, and one from Brian Cardell, switch syntax. We're going to dig into the container one. That's the one that we've been pushing on the hardest because I think it has it's got a few limitations, but its overall handles a broader set of use cases more cleanly. And the proposal has two parts. First, we have to define the containers that we want to query. And part of what we're doing here is trying to avoid infinite loops. What made containers queries impossible for a long time is that CSS layout is designed to work based on both context and content. Both contribute to the layout. So parents size based both on the context they're in, what space is available, and also based on the amount of content inside, the size of the children. So there's this constant back and forth. And if you start querying without breaking that loop, you can create sort of infinite query loops. So what we need to do is lock down our containers and say these can no longer be affected by the children. And we do that by adding containment. So what we need basically is to contain size and layout. Actually, we're finding now that we probably also need to contain style. So I will get that added into this slide. But size containment is really restrictive when we're doing it on 2 dimensions. We always want to be able to restrict just 1 dimension, usually the width or the inline axis, and allow the other axis to still flex. So 2D containment wasn't really going to give us what we wanted. So what we're working on right now is how to get 1D containment working. And it seems like inline size containment is working pretty well. There's a few edge cases that we need to solve, especially around writing modes and some other things. But overall, this is working pretty well. And in the current proposal, applying the appropriate containment, whether it's 1D or 2D, creates a container. I'm expecting this syntax to change because it's getting a little bit bulky and a little bit in the weeds. So probably we'll come up with either a new property or some new shorthand values here that give us a nicer syntax to access this. Once we've established containers, we want to query them. And that looks exactly like a media query, except with container instead. The other difference here will be that this should be able to react to actual font sizes or actual property values on the container itself, rather than the browser default font size that's usually 16 pixels and has nothing to do with the fonts on our page. That's not built into, we'll be looking at the prototype in a bit. That's not built into the prototype yet, but that will be the case once this is released. So to get a better sense of this, let's actually look at a couple demos. First off, I just made one that shows some of these cards responding to the viewport and some of them responding to the container. And I'm using Chrome Canary here with the flag turned on, which is where we have a prototype of container queries. So you can see the media ones. I'm gonna have to jump here. The media cards only respond to the overall width, where the container queries respond to the actual width. And it was pretty exciting to me that even within the first week of being able to prototype, that just worked. I was sort of expecting a long time before we would have that working. Here's a one that my colleague David Heron made, showing 3 identical block quotes in 3 different containers. And we can see they jump to a horizontal version, and then they also jump to a brighter, more styled version. And if we were to turn off containment, they would all fall back using similar fallbacks to how we do with media queries, where we design the small view externally and then larger views in the media query. We can get that same sort of fallback here. This can also be useful in, say, a Flexbox or grid layout. One thing that's important to understand here is that the container always has to be external to what's querying it. And that gives us a little bit of a problem in these contexts where the grid layout or the flex tracks, the spacing there is not an element. We can't look at an element and see the size of a track. So this is the one place where we need a little bit of a workaround. What we've done is we've added a second card wrapper around each article here so that one can act as the container and the other can query that container. So could require a little extra markup in these cases. That also gives you a way to say, here's a component that carries its container with it. And wherever we put it, the container is part of the component. So we have these two options of either external containers or containers that are part of a component. So here, every card creates its own containment, and then we can see each of those cards responding to its space, all of them together till there, and then they have different amounts of space depending on the flex layout. But each one responding individually, and at first that can be a little mind-bending. We have 5 different cards here, all with exactly the same code, and they look different on our page, and that's the point. Of course, we don't have to be practical about this. Jay Tompkins made a demo of interactive container queries making blinds go up and down. His is much more beautiful, but only works in Safari and won't actually quite work with container queries. He took advantage of a hack in a CSS or in a JavaScript polyfill. But I recreated the basics here using actual container queries. And the fun thing is, as the container gets bigger, we're actually making some of the elements smaller. So we don't have to be linear about this. We don't just have to make things bigger when the container gets bigger. But I thought that was a very clever little trick of his that we could play with. So get creative with these. There's a prototype in Chrome Canary. You have to download Canary, go to the Chrome flags URL, search for container queries and enable it. You're actually enabling 3 experiments when you do that: inline containment, container queries, and the new grid engine. So there are a few grid bugs that you'll run into that Chrome doesn't actually have. Feel free to report them. The engineers are always interested in the bugs that are there. And I link a lot more resources here. So all of these features are designed to get at those core things, building on what's there in CSS, building on the cascade that holds it all together. We are already able to make styles responsive and reusable, and we're just trying to build on that and really focus in on where they overlap. This reusable responsive components. To quote Jen Simmons, intrinsic web design is sort of what we're aiming at, this overlap where we want intrinsic sizes and components to have their intrinsic size and their intrinsic layout contained and then be able to move them around the page. So getting at these responsive modular components. Our medium is not done. Our medium is still going through radical changes, says Jen. So that's what I've got, and happy to take questions.
Thank you very much. Sure, there's a lot to take in. Any questions from anyone? Skulk, I know you have questions.
Yeah, I have a ton. So I think one that I am super interested in asking is, Miriam, with your background with especially Suzy and kind of like that whole space, I used to use, what was it called? Neat. Or the Neat, Bourbon Neat, quite a bit as well. Obviously, so we got Flexbox, which turned quite a lot of those, made them a bit redundant. Do you feel that a lot of CSS layout is still kind of stuck in that space and hasn't really embraced kind of what Flexbox actually gives us?
Yeah, and I think there's also been some confusion about Flexbox and Grid and how they relate. A lot of people sort of, in the same way that we hacked floats to be a grid, people then started hacking Flexbox to be a grid, and that's also a hack. Flexbox was never intended to be a grid. Ideally, Grid and Flexbox would have come out together, and you could see more clearly how exactly they are meant to relate. But Flexbox is really designed, both are designed around this idea of intrinsic sizing. So both of us, when we were building responsive layouts in the 2000s, 2010s with things like Suzy, the rule was basically that you strip out all intrinsic sizing and replace it with percentages. And you have to get rid of all that size. We took width and height off of our images. We wanted everything totally fluid. And with Grid and Flex, we're trying to move back the other direction and say, actually, these are built around intrinsic sizing. And they do it in slightly different ways. Flexbox is designed for random elements to share space in a somewhat smart way. And Flexbox is at its best when we touch it the least. It's not intended for us to be imposing a layout on it. And as soon as we start imposing layout on Flexbox, that's a good sign that maybe we want Grid instead. Because Grid is designed more for that parent element defining a layout and then children elements falling into place there. And then subgrid makes that even more powerful because it allows grandchildren to contribute back their sizing into that, their intrinsic size into that grandparent grid layout. But yeah, there's, Jen Simmons has talked about this a lot. She has a great labs, I think it's labs.jensimmons.com or something, where she shows all the different sorts of things that grids can do. And Rachel Andrew too with gridbyexample.com.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of gridbyexample.com. That's actually how I learned CSS Grid. Yeah, I 100% agree. I think Grid kind of very, like you spoke about intrinsic, like the intrinsic web, but I think it also fully realizes this kind of, I almost want to say, dream that a lot of us had, like way back from the early days of kind of like this actual real separation of concerns, because we never really had that. You know, like you couldn't effectively have something in your header but have it appear at the bottom of your site. You know, like there was always some degree of coupling there. No, definitely. And I often find that kind of this idea of kind of your 12 column grid and those type of things are actually a lot more nowadays more entrenched within the design, the kind of the UI design world than actually in the front end development world. Justin, you can probably speak to that as well, but I run into so many designers who kind of, you start almost second guessing yourself, like, because they just so, it's almost like the fact that you don't necessarily adhere to like a standardized 12 grid, like bootstrap type approach, kind of it's almost like as if you're missing something. Yeah, and like there's kind of a part of me that kind of is a bit saddened by that, insofar that, you know, we finally have these tools. You know, there used to be all these running jokes about like, what type of website are you designing? And there's like two bootstrap examples. And we finally have the tools to kind of transcend that. And no one's really actually using it. And I've always been curious whether it's a cultural thing or whether it's a workflow thing. But I would have loved to see people like kind of really, as you mentioned, lean into this concept that let the content determine how things are laid out, instead of starting with a specific layout and then chugging your content in there. Cool.
I think the fun thing is always the back and forth. Like what parts of the layout are imposed externally and how much can then we feed information back from the elements themselves back into that algorithm, which is sort of what grid min max and fit content and min and max content and all those help us manage those relationships.
I also very much appreciate kind of you starting out with that quote about, you know, like there's never going to be styling or design on the web. Like I do a lot of teaching. I have a lot of students, and I always quote, what was that article by Jacob Nielsen? I think it was titled "The End of Web Design," at around like the year 2000 or whatever. You know, and he essentially said, you know, we're moving into, I think he very much over anticipated the role things like RSS and so forth is going to play, like syndicated content. And he essentially said, you know, like in 10 years, no one's going to design a website. But no, here's the thing, but 20 years later, we're still talking about web design. So clearly that never happened. Yeah, like I always appreciate that. It's kind of like who was a guy? There's apparently some Nobel Prize economist who also said that the effect of the internet will be the same as a fax machine or something. Yeah, I always appreciate those type of quotes.
That's interesting too, because Hao-Kwon Lee, when he made the proposal, he said the web would have turned into a fax machine if we didn't have CSS. We would have just
100%.
been sharing images, and it's a fax machine.
Yeah.
There are a couple of questions in the chat. So one from Jonathan, and yeah, this is something I'd like to ask as well. You know, when your day-to-day life is working, designing, working with code and so on, it's rather difficult to keep up with all these things. And that's what do you have any suggestions of a as someone who's not, you know, obviously in part of the working group or anything like that, and doesn't necessarily, I mean, I hop onto GitHub and I go and read something, and then and 90% of it I don't understand because I don't have context, and then I go, oh, this looks good, and then I try and read it, but I don't really understand it, and
yeah,
I mean, this might be an unanswerable question, but do you think there's what's a good way to kind of keep up with all these kinds of developments, so we know what to look out for? Because I think there's a lot of stuff that CSS has been so productive in the last year or so. We've got so much new stuff. Is where, you know, and on. I see Safari finally shipped Gap in Flexbox, you know, so all of these things, but how many of us are actually using them in our day-to-day work? Because they pass us by a little bit. Yeah, I mean, it's a kind of a broad question.
I think part of what can cause that sense of a fire hose is that you're watching both features that the CSS Working Group is inventing now, which, I mean, if we think about it, Grid landed in all the browsers in 2017. It was actually being developed for about 5 years before that.
Yeah.
And now we're starting to see people pick it up more often, right? So there's actually sort of this 10-year span where you might be paying attention to a new feature. And because of that, you get even more overlap, right? So right now we're talking about container queries, which you may not start using for 5 years. I mean, hopefully we get them sooner than that. Hopefully you're able to upgrade sooner than that, but it takes time for people to pick up these new things. Yeah. And meanwhile, you're also paying attention to, say, is and where selectors that are finally landing in browsers, even though we've been talking about them for 10 years. And trying to keep those two separate, I think, can be useful. And it doesn't mean that you only pay attention to one or only pay attention to the other, but remember that you have plenty of time to learn the things I'm showing you now. Anybody that wants to play with them, part of why we like to talk about them early is to get that feedback. Container queries, now that we have a prototype, are changing. It's not going to look like my initial proposal because we're learning things as we prototype them. So people playing with those prototypes are useful, but you don't need to start integrating anything I've shown here into your sites yet. Meanwhile, for some of the other things, actually watching what's landing in browsers can be really interesting. And browsers generally put out release notes when they release. Each of the browsers releases 6 weeks to 6 months, depending on the browser. And usually in those release notes, it's two new things in CSS. And so you can slow down the fire hose of new information by looking at like what's actually landed, and is this now in most browsers or just in this one? So I'll often check release notes and then compare it to can I use and say, is this something I need to know for development, for production right now? Can I start using this right away or not? So that can be a way to narrow down, like, what do I need to know now?
Mm-hmm.
And then there are great sites that try to do some of that curating for you. I mean, Stephanie Eccles' Modern CSS, or
Oh yes, that's fantastic. Yeah.
yeah, and there's a lot more. I mean, Rachel Andrews is always doing good courses and talks, and lately Andy Bell has been doing a lot, and I know that there are others.
Thanks. We're all using these UI design tools nowadays, like Figma and Sketch and whatnot. And there's a question from was wondering, is there any overlap between what happens in those tools and what happens in something like the CSS Working Group? If someone from Figma, for their exporting and mapping and all of that kind of stuff, or is it purely browser makers?
I mean, the chair of the CSS Working Group is from Adobe, so it's not just browser makers. And actually, there's some other interesting things you maybe don't think of, like a lot of the vendors that build CSS into their tools are publishers doing print content. So there's e-readers, mobile mobile books, whatever that's called. So there's like all these different media represented there, not just the web browsers, not just the web.
Right.
But yeah, I think actually one of the most interesting developments there in terms of tying into design tools is actually not in the CSS Working Group, but a new community group that started up that I think you can just join if you want to. I think anybody can join community groups, and it's the Design Tokens community group, is mainly made up of those design tool vendors, all working together to define a standard for design tokens. That's the term Gina coined for colors and fonts, abstractions on a site. So that's starting to develop, and I think we'll have a lot more sort of bringing them all into the same space and discussing how these things work and how they then interact with shipping that information to JavaScript or CSS. Right.
No, that's interesting. Remember Adobe, now that you mentioned them, it just popped into my mind that they had proposed, was it regions or something in CSS years ago? I don't think it ever happened, but now that you mention it, that was an Adobe thing.
Yeah, and it's an interesting one.
Demo.
Yeah, it's the way a lot of these features work is we find that there's some steps we need to take to get there. So for container queries, for example, first we had to implement containment, and then we had to discover that containment was too hard and we needed single access containment. And so like container queries, people have been working on for years, and the reason it's possible now is actually because of somewhat boring and behind the scenes things that were built in the meantime that make it possible.
Right.
And regions is similar to that in that a lot of the energy behind Grid came out of those regions discussions.
Okay.
And so those region discussions are ongoing and still being looked at as like, is this the next step of Grid being able to do something with regions?
Okay.
Which is
That's
more control over the flow of how things would go into a...
Right. Sorry, Skulk. So something like placing something on a grid by specifying its column and row position, would that as an example of something that may have come out from regions, or am I barking up the wrong tree there?
Yeah, and I wasn't involved with the working group at that time, so I maybe can't give all the specifics, but yeah, it's very clear that Grid was heavily influenced by regions and is still part of the conversation of future grid layers.
Go.
I remember there also being like, like I think my memory is a bit fuzzy here, but I remember there also being like other kind of modules that I guess superseded Grid. Like I think there was something called CSS Advanced Layout or something like that. Yeah, there was another one. They all have these super vague names, but I always just kind of assumed they fed into Grid because they kind of also very much started this exploration in terms of thinking about the web in terms of 2 dimensions. or 2 dimensions at the same time. You know, theoretically, Flex kind of looked at 2 dimensions, but 2 dimensions like a dimension at a time. You
Right.
couldn't, like, it wasn't aware of 2 dimensions simultaneously. Yeah. So I think I also, you know, so I think I'm like, I'm one of those people that really enjoy reading the spec. And so I've been poking around recently, and I've been seeing a lot of like upcoming proposed things that look very much function-ish, you know, where you feed a value in. So I guess maybe speaking to your experience with kind of working with SAS and so forth, obviously, you know, like that was an early attempt at kind of turning CSS into a programmatic language. Do you think CSS is kind of at one point going to reach like some type of inflection point where we're going to say, listen, like what we needed to do now is beyond the realm of just purely declarative language? We need to kind of like add like some programmatic logic now. Do you think we're ever going to reach such a point?
Well, I think in some ways we already have. I mean,
Mm.
it's still in a declarative way, but we have functions and we have variables, and you can do a lot of programming in those functions and variables. So in some ways, we're already past that. And in other ways, what's happening more is with Houdini. If you look up Houdini.how, Houdini is the browser's allowing you to hook into different steps of the rendering process. So hook into how styles are assigned, or hook into how layout is determined, or hook into the actual paint step of painting pixels. And then giving you the ability to write your own worklets. So basically the idea is, if you have an idea for regions, you can now hook directly into a browser engine and write your regions proposal, and it will work in CSS using some JS in the background, and more performant than if you were trying to do it without that ability to hook into the browser engine. So the idea is that the core language doesn't need to go that far if we make ways for it to be extensible when you need to. And then hopefully also that gives us cow paths to pave in the future. So if you get regions solved pretty well using a Houdini worklet, then the CSS Working Group can just come along and say, yes, please, let's make that part of the language.
Right, yeah.
Mm.
If you have a little bit more time, there's a couple more questions, if you're okay with that.
Sure.
I guess an inevitable one that we're also wondering about. What stage are layers and scope styles in at the moment in the recommendation track? Are they far along the way, or is it still a long time to go before we can start seeing them in action?
Layers, there is only one issue still open. Mostly that spec is solid. The only issue that's open is some people think maybe we shouldn't call it layers, we should call it something else. It's possible that they'll come up with a new word for it. But otherwise, that spec is done. Browsers seem pretty happy with it. It seems like it's going to be the easiest one for browsers to implement, which doesn't necessarily mean they'll prioritize it. But I expect, I've been working closest with Chrome and Microsoft developers recently, and they seem like they're likely to get to it later this year. I expect other browsers will also move on that one fairly quickly. I think that one has some limitations in how fast people will be able to actually feel comfortable starting to use it, because the fallback is old browsers don't read anything inside of a layer. And that's not an ideal fallback, right? It will work in some cases, but not always. So I think that one we'll see very quickly in browsers, but then it might take a little time before developers really pick up use of it. Container queries, the prototype is happening. It's going well. I expect we'll have a first draft spec still this quarter, and we'll be fleshing that out over the year. It's hard to say then how quickly everybody agrees on how we're handling all the edge cases. There's a lot in there. There's a lot of tweaking little holes where CSS tries to do an infinite loop and we need to stop it. So hard to say, but lots of excitement behind that one. So I assume once we have it figured out, browsers will move fairly quickly. And that one has a much smoother upgrade path. So then I hope people will be able to start using it right away as soon as it's out. Scope is the farthest behind. There's still the most questions there on exactly how it should work, exactly where proximity should fit in the cascade, things like that. And that one has the most existing developer tools already solving the problem. So I think that's a little bit farther behind, but hopefully at least stabilizing as a spec in the next year.
That's great. Thanks for that. Any other questions?
So I have another, like I can just go on like all evening. Shadow DOM, like am I the only one that kind of feels like that didn't really pan out as I hoped it would? It kind of feels strange that we're still talking about issues around scoping in 2021. Yeah, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that, Miriam.
Yeah, I would say that part of the problem there is that we've used scope to mean lots of different things. And that term, it means so many things that solving one of them doesn't solve the whole space. So there was an attempt at solving scope back in 2014, and it was sort of canned in favor of Shadow DOM. And the idea was, let's see what Shadow DOM does and doesn't solve, and then we can come back and try to solve the rest. And I think that's what's happening now. And I think it depends a little bit who you ask how well it worked. Some people want really heavy isolation. It's really designed around a sort of, you have a Twitter widget you want to embed in any website, and you don't want it impacted by that website too much. You sort of want those hard boundaries and a lot of control over what can get through. And Shadow DOM does that. And there's some improvements that can happen on it. There's actually some interesting proposals for declarative Shadow DOM and ways to style Shadow DOM more easily, things like that. I think those are interesting proposals. When I was looking at it, I felt like this namespacing and scoping of selectors issue needed to be a lot more fluid and a lot weaker in a sense, less dramatic in order for it to fit into CSS better. And I think that's the thing that we lost by focusing on Shadow DOM. But I think they're separate problems, and we can solve both.
No, fair enough.
One last question, and then we will let you go. Framework. Frameworks have become ubiquitous. You mentioned, Bootstrap as an example in your slides, but now there's Tailwind, and prior to that, there were things like Foundation, and so on and so on and so on. I think there's an inherent danger in frameworks that, in a sense, you learn the framework rather than the underlying, the underlying theories behind how CSS actually works.
Yeah, I mean, I think that danger, that's always going to be there, right? And I think a little bit unavoidable. We're going to want tools to handle things that are repetitive or still not built into the browser the way we would hope. And that's always going to a little bit be the case. And then we want easy paths in for junior developers. We want a way for them to pick up and feel like they're contributing quickly, and frameworks can help that happen. I'm more concerned with boot camps and other training programs ignoring CSS or thinking that CSS is just a list of hacks
Right.
And
Yeah.
not teaching the system. I think when we're teaching CSS, we have to be very clear what the system is, how it's designed to work. It is very systemic. It's not just a lot of tricks and hacks.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah,
I
I think
remember
Justin
watching
and I can go on for hours on that topic.
But we won't. I remember watching a talk of yours, Miriam, where you spoke about that's everywhere with the overflow, and how that's a feature, not an error. And I think that a lot of people that is an error, right? CSS is broken, but that's actually how CSS works. Yeah.
Yeah, we have a default of overflow visible because we don't want to lose content by default. And if you look at what InDesign does, it just hides all of the content. You lose the entire word. If you do CSS is awesome in InDesign, you get a blank box. And I find it hard to imagine that that's better for the web.
Yeah, exactly. I
so
think
maybe,
yeah.
So maybe great. On that, sorry, I'm interrupting you, Justin.
I don't want us to in Miriam's day for too long.
Yeah. There's just one
more, Scott.
Yeah, like, so I think, and this is maybe a good one in closing, like, what is your tool chain like? Like, how do you just write like styles.css, here we go? Is that your tool chain?
I still actually use Sass quite a bit, and mostly for the design tokens question. I feel like CSS doesn't right now, and likely won't. I don't know that there's a strong reason for it in CSS. Won't have the sort of structured token storage that we would want. And I know a lot of people are putting that into YAML or into JSON or something. I don't like that because it makes everything a string. And if I want to do relationships between colors, those are string-based relationships. I can copy and paste my saturation or something, but I can't actually use a function that understands color as a type. And Sass and other languages that are built for design understand unit conversion, unit relationships. And there's a lot of that. While some of that is moving into CSS, we can do calc functions, we can do we're getting color functions soon. I'm super excited about that one. It makes sense that some things can be solved on the server before we ship, and then we don't have to make the browser figure it out. It will be great to have the browser figure out some things, but there's still always going to be logic we can solve on the server side and not burden the browser with it. So I still use Sass for that. I put all my colors in maps, and then I often just loop over those maps in Sass to generate CSS variables that I'm then using in my CSS. But Sass is still a big part of my toolchain.
Would that just be Node Sass, or would that be through like Webpack or something?
At this point, Dart Sass is the only one that's up to date and being maintained. Node Sass has been deprecated because it didn't have enough development to keep up with the language. So if you're using Node Sass and you run into Sass bugs that are frustrating, it's because you're on a 6-year-old version of Sass, and moving to Dart Sass will get you up to speed very quick.
I think that also just goes to show like how long it's been since I've used Sass as an actual CLI tool and not as embedded in some type of loader or something. The fact that I didn't even know that.
It depends on what project we're on, whether we'll use other loaders around that or not. That just depends on, are we in a Vue project or a React project or something else?
Cool. That's all from my side.
Great. Thank you so much for your time. We've really enjoyed having you speak with us. So thank you very much. Thanks to everyone who's attended. And Miriam actually mentioned something that I forgot to mention at the beginning, and that was around Stephanie Eccles. So I don't know if anyone noticed, but she's doing a Smashing Magazine course in CSS, which is a lot of the things that she's done on her website. but they're also giving away 4 sponsorships to underrepresented people. So I've shared the link in the ZA Tech front end channel for everyone. If you wouldn't mind just passing that on, I think that would be a great opportunity for a lot of people to apply for that. Yeah, it's kind of when you factor in our exchange rate courses. So pass that along, everyone, please. So yeah, thanks again. Thank you, Miriam. Thanks everyone for attending, and hopefully we'll see you at the next one.
Thank you. Good to meet you all.
Thanks very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.